November 8, 1975. Madison Square Garden, New York City. 9:47 p.m. Muhammad Ali had just knocked Joe Frazier to the canvas in the 14th round. 20,000 people were on their feet, screaming, celebrating the fight of the century. But in the VIP section, one man wasn't watching the ring. Detective Richie Roberts was staring at a figure in a $100,000 chinchilla coat, sitting 3 rows ahead of him. "Who the hell is that guy?" Roberts whispered to his partner. The man in the coat was calm, confident, surrounded by beautiful women and expensive jewelry. He looked like old money, like corporate power, like someone who belonged in those VIP seats. But Roberts had been a cop for 15 years. He knew the difference between legitimate wealth and something else entirely. That question would destroy Frank Lucas's invisible empire. For 7 years, Frank had been the most powerful man in Harlem that nobody knew existed. Tonight, he'd made himself visible, and visibility, for Frank Lucas, was a death sentence. But to understand how one coat destroyed a criminal empire, you need to understand the man who wore it. Frank Lucas had spent 7 years perfecting the art of invisibility. While other criminals flashed gold chains and drove Cadillacs, Frank drove a beat-up Chevy and wore cheap suits. While they bought mansions in Manhattan, Frank lived in a modest house in Mount Vernon. While they partied in nightclubs, Frank stayed home with his family. This wasn't an accident. This was strategy. Frank understood something that most criminals never learned. The moment you look like a criminal, you become a target. The moment you act rich, people start asking questions, and questions were the one thing Frank's operation couldn't survive. For 7 years, Frank had been moving more merchandise through New York than the 5 Italian families combined. He'd built a direct pipeline from Southeast Asia to American streets that bypassed every traditional criminal organization. He generated millions in profits while staying completely invisible to law enforcement. His operation was perfect because nobody knew it existed. But success is a dangerous drug, and by 1975, Frank Lucas was overdosing on his own power. The change started slowly. First, it was the house. Frank moved his family from Mount Vernon to a mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey. 17 rooms, swimming pool, tennis court. Then came the cars. The beat-up Chevy was replaced with a Mercedes, then a Rolls-Royce, then a Ferrari. Frank told himself he deserved it. He'd earned it. He'd outsmarted every law enforcement agency in America for 7 years. Why shouldn't he enjoy the fruits of his labor? The clothes came next. Frank started shopping at the most expensive stores in Manhattan. Custom suits that cost more than most people's cars. Italian leather shoes. Swiss watches. Diamond rings. He was still careful. Still strategic. But the line between confidence and arrogance was getting thinner every day. Frank's wife, Julie, tried to warn him. "Baby, you're getting too flashy," she'd say. "People are gonna notice." But Frank brushed off her concerns. He'd been invisible for so long, he'd forgotten how dangerous visibility could be. The breaking point came when Frank decided to attend the Ali Frazier fight. This wasn't just any boxing match. This was the Thrilla in Manila rematch at Madison Square Garden, the biggest sporting event of the year. 20,000 people, including politicians, celebrities, and every major figure in New York's underworld. It was exactly the kind of high-profile event Frank had avoided for 7 years. But Frank wasn't thinking about strategy anymore. He was thinking about status, about proving to himself and everyone else that he'd made it, that he belonged among New York's elite. And what better way to prove that than by wearing the most expensive coat anyone had ever seen? Frank spent $100,000 on a full-length chinchilla coat. Custom-made, imported from Alaska, lined with silk. It was magnificent. It was also the most expensive piece of clothing in Madison Square Garden that night. And everyone noticed. Detective Richie Roberts was at the fight, working security detail. Roberts was different from most cops in 1975. He was honest in a department riddled with corruption. He'd turned in bags of cash that other detectives would have pocketed. He'd refused bribes that could have made him rich. And he had an instinct for spotting things that didn't belong. When Roberts saw Frank in that chinchilla coat, everything about the scene felt wrong. The man was clearly black, clearly from the streets, but he was sitting in VIP seats that cost more than most cops made in a year. He was surrounded by people who looked like money, but there was something street about all of them. Most importantly, Roberts had never seen this man before, and Roberts knew every major player in New York's criminal underworld. "That guy's dirty money," Roberts told his partner. "I can feel it." During the intermission, Roberts made his move. He walked past Frank's section, memorizing faces, listening to conversations, noting details. Frank was holding court, telling stories, acting like he owned the place. But Roberts noticed something else. Frank was careful never to mention his name or what he did for a living. Even in his moment of maximum visibility, Frank was still trying to stay invisible. After the fight, Roberts went back to the precinct and started making calls. He contacted every detective in every borough. "I'm looking for a black male, mid-40s, serious money, hangs with an expensive crew, wears a chinchilla coat that costs more than my car." Nobody knew who Roberts was talking about, and that made Roberts even more suspicious. A man with that kind of money should be on everyone's radar. If the Italian families didn't know him, if the Irish mob hadn't heard of him, if no other detective had seen him before, then he was either completely legitimate or completely off the grid. And nobody legitimate wore $100,000 coats to boxing matches. Roberts started what he called the code investigation. He visited every furrier in Manhattan, asking who had bought an expensive chinchilla coat recently. Most shops kept records of their high-end customers. After 2 weeks, Roberts found his answer. Frank Lucas. Address in Teaneck, New Jersey. No known criminal record. No arrests. No connection to any known criminal organization. That was impossible. You don't make the kind of money that buys $100,000 coats without being on someone's radar. Roberts knew Frank Lucas was dirty. He just had to prove it. Roberts started surveillance on Frank's house in Teaneck. What he found shocked him. Frank lived like a millionaire, but he had no visible source of income. No job, no business, no legitimate explanation for his wealth. His wife drove a Mercedes. His kids went to private school. The house was worth more than Roberts would make in 20 years of police work. More importantly, Roberts noticed the visitors. Men from Harlem coming to Frank's house at all hours. Quick conversations, brief exchanges, then they'd leave. It looked like a business operation. But what kind of business required that level of secrecy? Roberts expanded his investigation. He started following Frank's visitors back to Harlem. What he found was an organization unlike anything he'd ever seen. It operated like a corporation, with clear hierarchies and professional management, but it was dealing in merchandise that wasn't exactly legal. The more Roberts investigated, the more impressed he became. This wasn't some street corner operation. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating under everyone's nose for years, and Frank Lucas was running it all from a mansion in New Jersey, while staying completely invisible to law enforcement. Until he wore that coat. The investigation took Roberts 8 months. 8 months of surveillance, wiretaps, undercover operations, and careful detective work. What Roberts uncovered was the most sophisticated criminal operation in New York history. Frank had built a direct supply chain from Southeast Asia that bypassed every traditional criminal organization. He generated millions in profits while avoiding violence, territorial disputes, and law enforcement attention. Frank's operation was so clean, so professional, so invisible that Roberts had trouble getting other cops to take it seriously. "He doesn't look like a criminal," his captain said. "He acts like a businessman." That was exactly the point. Frank had revolutionized criminal enterprise by not looking criminal. January 28, 1976. Frank Lucas was having breakfast with his family when 50 federal agents surrounded his house. Roberts led the raid personally. When they broke down the door, Frank was sitting at his kitchen table reading the newspaper, wearing a simple bathrobe. No weapons, no resistance, no drama. Just a quiet man having morning coffee. "Frank Lucas, you're under arrest," Roberts said. Frank looked up from his newspaper and smiled. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Detective Roberts." Frank had known about the investigation for months. He'd seen the surveillance cars, noticed the phone taps, recognized the undercover agents. But instead of running or fighting, Frank had done something that surprised everyone. He'd started preparing to surrender. During the arrest, Roberts found something that explained everything. In Frank's bedroom closet, hanging next to dozens of expensive suits, was the chinchilla coat. Frank had kept it as a reminder of the moment his invisibility died. A reminder of the mistake that destroyed everything he'd built. Frank Lucas was sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. He eventually cooperated with law enforcement, providing information that led to the arrest of dozens of corrupt officials and criminal associates. He served 15 years and was released in 19... But Frank never forgot the lesson of the chinchilla coat. In interviews years later, he'd say, "I stayed invisible for 7 years. Then I wanted people to see me. Big mistake. The moment they see you, it's over." Detective Richie Roberts became famous for the Frank Lucas case. It launched his career and established him as one of the most effective organized crime investigators in American history. But Roberts always said the case solved itself. Frank Lucas caught himself. Roberts would explain, "I just happened to be there when he did it." The MINK coat mistake became legendary in law enforcement circles. Police academies still teach it as a case study in how criminal psychology can lead to self-destruction. Frank Lucas had built the perfect criminal empire. He'd outsmarted every law enforcement agency in America. He generated millions in profits while avoiding violence and territorial wars, and he destroyed it all for one night of feeling important. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. He'd spent 7 years studying successful criminals, learning from their mistakes, building an organization that avoided every trap that had destroyed his predecessors. But in the end, he fell into the same trap that destroys every criminal empire. He started believing his own legend. He started thinking he was untouchable. Frank Lucas proved something that law enforcement had suspected for years. The most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who act like criminals. They're the ones who act like businessmen. They don't wear gold chains and drive flashy cars. They wear expensive coats and sit in VIP sections. They don't look dangerous. They look successful. But success is the most dangerous drug of all. And Frank Lucas overdosed on November 8, 1975, in a VIP section at Madison Square Garden, wearing a $100,000 coat that cost him everything. The fight that night lasted 15 rounds. Frank's empire fell in one. If this story of success, vanity, and consequences moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that sometimes the biggest enemy is your own ego. Share this with someone who knows that the moment you stop being careful is the moment everything falls apart. What would you have done if you were Frank Lucas? Let me know in the comments below.